Hi, Scorpio. Wow, the energy coming through already feels incredibly strong. I keep getting this feeling that something is changing around the way people see you. Not because you're explaining yourself. Not because you're trying to prove a point. But because the truth has a way of revealing itself when the timing is right. And honestly, I feel like that's exactly what's happening here. Someone who thought they had you figured out is starting to realize they were missing a huge part of the story. Okay, you've been quiet for a reason. You've been pulling your energy back, focusing on yourself, letting people believe whatever they wanted to believe. But now, the narrative is shifting. The masks are slipping. And the more the truth comes to light, the harder it becomes for certain people to ignore what they've been refusing to see. There is something about this energy that feels impossible to ignore now. For a long time, I think some of you stopped trying to explain yourselves. Stop trying to convince people of your intentions. Stop trying to correct every misunderstanding. And honestly, that feels important. Because as I'm looking at these cards, the first one that immediately catches my attention is the Judgment card. Wow. It feels like something is finally being called into the light. Not because Scorpio is demanding answers. Not because Scorpio is fighting for validation. But because certain things can only stay hidden for so long before they begin revealing themselves. I keep feeling that phrase. The truth has its own timing. And for many of you, that timing feels very close. There may have been people who believed a certain version of you. A version built from assumptions. A version built from half-truths. A version built from stories they heard rather than experiences they actually had with you. But something is changing. Because the energy I'm feeling isn't about Scorpio defending themselves. It's about people beginning to see what has been there all along. Okay, that feels significant. Because when I look at the Six of Wands beside the Judgment card, I get this image of someone quietly walking forward while the noise behind them slowly fades away, not rushing, not arguing, not looking over their shoulder, just continuing forward. And somehow that silence is becoming more powerful than any explanation ever could have been. Someone is watching this happen. Actually, several people may be watching this happen. People who once questioned you. People who once doubted your intentions. People who may have believed things that were never entirely true. They're starting to notice a difference. They're starting to notice that your actions never really matched the story they were told, and that realization is becoming difficult to ignore. Honestly, some of you have been carrying the weight of being misunderstood for a very long time, long enough that you eventually stopped trying to fix it, long enough that you decided your peace mattered more than changing somebody else's opinion. And strangely enough, that decision seems to be creating the shift itself. Because the more detached you become from needing approval, the more people begin questioning what they thought they knew. I keep looking at the King of Cups here. This energy feels incredibly calm, not passive, not weak, just calm. The kind of calm that comes from knowing who you are. The kind of calm that doesn't panic every time someone misunderstands you. The kind of calm that understands that truth eventually reveals itself without force. There may be someone in particular who is struggling with this realization. Someone who thought they had Scorpio figured out. Someone who felt very confident in their perspective, and now, they're not so sure anymore. Because pieces aren't fitting together the way they used to. The narrative they believed is starting to crack. The certainty they once had is beginning to disappear, and they're being forced to look deeper. Wow, I just got chills. Because the Death card is sitting here, and it feels very different from what people expect. This doesn't feel dramatic. It doesn't feel chaotic. It feels quiet. Almost like standing in a room and realizing everything has changed while nobody was paying attention. Scorpio, I feel like you've changed. Not in a way that needs to be announced. Not in a way that needs recognition. But in a way that can be felt. You've outgrown something. Maybe you've outgrown the need to be understood by everyone. Maybe you've outgrown the need to defend your heart. Maybe you've outgrown people who only valued you when they could control the narrative. Whatever it is, the old version of this situation cannot survive where you're standing now. And people are beginning to notice. They're noticing your confidence. They're noticing your emotional control. They're noticing that you're no longer reacting the way they expected you to react. And that alone is making them question everything. Because when someone expects conflict and receives silence, when someone expects desperation and receives dignity, when someone expects weakness and receives strength, it changes the entire story. Okay, there is definitely somebody here who is looking at Scorpio differently. I don't think they've said anything yet. I don't even know if they've fully admitted it to themselves. But they're observing, they're paying attention. And the more they observe, the more difficult it becomes to hold on to the version of Scorpio they've been carrying in their mind. Because what they're seeing now and what they believed before, those two things don't match anymore. And that realization feels like the beginning of something much bigger than they expected. And that realization feels like the beginning of something much bigger than they expected. Because the more I sit with this energy, the more I feel someone replaying moments they once dismissed. Little things, conversations, acts of kindness, situations they barely acknowledged at the time. And somehow those memories are coming back differently now. The Six of Cups is here, and honestly, it feels like someone wandering through old memories, looking for something they missed. Looking for the moment where things started changing. Looking for the moment where they stopped seeing clearly. You know? Sometimes people don't realize what someone meant to them until enough time has passed for perspective to arrive, and perspective is arriving, slowly, quietly, but it's arriving. The interesting thing is that this person doesn't seem comfortable with what they're discovering, because every memory they're revisiting seems to challenge something they previously believed. I keep feeling this energy of someone saying, wait a minute, maybe I didn't see that correctly. Maybe there was more happening than I realized. And that takes us directly into the energy of the Hanged Man. Wow, this feels like a complete shift in viewpoint. Not because somebody forced them to change their mind. Not because Scorpio is trying to convince them of anything. But because they're finally allowing themselves to look at the situation from a different angle. There may have been moments when Scorpio gave more than anyone noticed. Moments when Scorpio protected the connection quietly. Moments when Scorpio chose understanding over conflict, compassion over pride, patience over reaction, things that went completely unseen at the time. And now those moments are returning to this person's awareness one by one. Honestly, I think that's where some of the regret is beginning. Because regret rarely arrives all at once. It usually starts with one realization, one memory, one uncomfortable truth, and suddenly everything else begins connecting together. I keep seeing someone sitting alone with their thoughts, not distracted. Not running from their emotions, just thinking. Thinking about things they never questioned before. Thinking about things they took for granted. Thinking about the possibility that Scorpio may have been carrying far more emotional weight than they ever understood. The Page of Swords keeps pulling my attention. This feels like observation, watching, paying attention, trying to gather pieces of information that were overlooked before. Someone is becoming very curious about Scorpio, not in a casual way, in a way that feels personal. Because they're trying to understand who Scorpio really is underneath all the assumptions they once accepted as truth. And I don't think they expected what they would find. Okay, this energy is getting emotional. Because the more they look, the more they realize Scorpio was never who they thought Scorpio was. There is depth here. There is loyalty here. There is strength here. There is a level of sacrifice here that they didn't fully appreciate. And that realization is creating an ache inside them. Not because Scorpio did something wrong, but because they are beginning to understand how much they may have misunderstood. The Lovers is sitting here, and I can't ignore it. This feels less like a decision being made and more like somebody recognizing the significance of a connection, recognizing that not every connection feels the same. Not every person leaves the same impact. Not every relationship continues living inside your thoughts long after distance has entered the picture. There is something about Scorpio that continues showing up in this person's mind. And the more they try to understand why, the more they realize the answer may be much deeper than they wanted to admit. Because what if Scorpio wasn't just another chapter? What if Scorpio was one of the most important chapters? What if the person they walked away from, or allowed themselves to misunderstand, was actually far more valuable than they ever realized? Wow, that question alone feels like it's changing everything inside this person's world. And the deeper they go into those thoughts, the harder it becomes to ignore what their heart is trying to tell them. And the deeper they go into those thoughts, the harder it becomes to ignore what their heart is trying to tell them. Because something else is surfacing here. Something that has been sitting beneath the surface for longer than most people realize. And honestly, I don't think this person expected to discover it. The moment I look at the moon, I get that feeling when you walk into a room and suddenly realize there was a conversation happening long before you arrived. Pieces are missing. Details don't add up. Certain stories start sounding different when viewed through a different lens. And somebody is beginning to notice exactly that. You know, there are times when confusion isn't created by a lack of truth. It's created by too many voices speaking at the same time. Too many opinions. Too many assumptions. Too many people adding their version of events. And somewhere along the way, the original truth becomes difficult to hear. That's what this feels like. I keep sensing an outside influence. A person who may have benefited from keeping things unclear. A person who may have enjoyed being in control of the narrative, not necessarily because they were powerful, but because they were afraid. Afraid of what would happen if people saw things as they truly were. The Seven of Swords is sitting here and the energy feels slippery, like somebody spent a long time avoiding accountability, a long time redirecting attention, a long time making sure certain questions were never asked. But those questions are being asked now, and that's changing everything, because people are no longer accepting things at face value. They're looking deeper. They're comparing actions with words. They're examining timelines. They're noticing inconsistencies. And once somebody starts noticing inconsistencies, it's very difficult to go back to blind trust. Honestly, I don't think Scorpio has to say much at all. That's the interesting part. The energy doesn't feel confrontational. It doesn't feel like Scorpio is standing up and exposing anybody. It feels more like the truth is exposing itself, quietly, naturally, almost effortlessly. The Justice card feels incredibly strong here. Not dramatic, not explosive, just inevitable. Like a scale slowly finding balance after being tilted for a very long time. And there are people around this situation who are beginning to see things differently. People who once accepted a certain version of events. People who once believed what they were told. People who may have unknowingly contributed to misunderstandings. They're starting to pull back. Starting to question, starting to wonder if they were only seeing part of the picture. Okay, this is interesting, because the Five of Wands feels less like conflict and more like the aftermath of conflict. The moment where everyone realizes they've been fighting over something they didn't fully understand. The moment where emotions settle just enough for clarity to enter the room. I keep feeling that someone is becoming very uncomfortable. Not Scorpio, someone else. Someone who was confident that their version of events would never be challenged. Someone who thought certain secrets would stay buried. Because every day that passes, another piece seems to fall into place. Another perspective emerges. Another conversation happens. Another person begins connecting dots. And what once looked convincing is beginning to lose its power. Wow. There is something almost poetic about this energy. Because Scorpio spent so much time being misunderstood that eventually they stopped chasing validation altogether. And now, the people who refuse to listen are finding themselves face to face with truths they can no longer avoid. Not because Scorpio forced them to, not because Scorpio demanded it, because reality has a way of revealing itself. The masks become heavier. The stories become harder to maintain. The contradictions become impossible to ignore. And somewhere inside all of this, someone is realizing that the connection they once questioned may have been affected by influences they never properly recognized. That realization feels bigger than they're prepared for. Because once they fully accept what really happened, they're going to have to face another question they haven't been ready to answer. And that question is beginning to move closer every single day. Because once the noise starts fading away, people are left alone with themselves, alone with their thoughts, alone with their memories, alone with the things they tried not to feel. And honestly, that feels exactly where this person's energy is right now. The Nine of Swords is impossible to ignore, not because they're falling apart, not because they're losing control, but because there is something keeping them awake. Something replaying itself over and over again in the quiet moments. You know those moments when the world finally slows down? When there are no distractions, no conversations, no obligations, just silence. That's when Scorpio shows up, not physically, but in their mind, in their heart, in the memories they keep revisiting. And the strange thing is, the harder they try not to think about it, the more present it becomes. I keep feeling someone reaching for their phone and putting it back down. Thinking about sending a message, thinking about checking in, thinking about saying something, anything, and yet they stop themselves because they don't know what happens after that. The Eight of Swords feels very personal here. This doesn't feel like outside interference anymore. This feels internal. This feels like somebody trapped inside their own thoughts. Somebody who keeps imagining different outcomes, different conversations, different versions of how things could have gone, and every version seems to bring them back to the same realization. They miss Scorpio. Wow, that landed hard. Because I don't think this person expected to miss Scorpio this much. I think they assumed time would create distance. I think they assumed life would move on. I think they assumed feelings would fade naturally. But something very different happened. The distance didn't erase the connection, it highlighted it. Every day without Scorpio became another reminder of what Scorpio brought into their life. The Six of Cups is showing me memories again, not dramatic memories, not life-changing moments, simple things, a conversation, a laugh. The way Scorpio listened when nobody else understood. The way Scorpio could see through them without making them feel judged. The way Scorpio somehow made difficult days feel lighter. Okay, this is becoming emotional. Because this person is starting to realize they didn't just lose a connection. They lost a feeling of comfort, a feeling of being seen, a feeling of being understood. And those things are much harder to replace than people think. Honestly, I don't even know if they've admitted this to anyone. This feels private. The kind of realization that happens behind closed doors. The kind of realization that arrives when nobody else is watching. Because outwardly, they may look fine. They may be smiling, working, living their life, doing everything they're supposed to do. But inwardly, Scorpio is still there. The memory of Scorpio is still there. The absence of Scorpio is still there. And every time they try to move forward, without fully addressing those feelings, something pulls them back. The Knight of Cups keeps drawing my attention. Not because I see immediate action, but because I see emotion becoming impossible to suppress. There is only so long someone can carry feelings without eventually wanting to express them. Only so long someone can hold words inside before those words begin looking for a way out. I keep hearing this energy say, I should have said something. I should have handled that differently. I should have understood sooner. And regret. Regret has a way of growing when clarity arrives, especially when clarity arrives after the opportunity seemed gone. Wow, this person is looking at Scorpio very differently now. Not through confusion, not through assumptions, not through somebody else's opinions. They're looking through their own heart. And the more honest they become with themselves, the more difficult it becomes to deny what this connection truly meant. Because somewhere deep inside, they're beginning to understand that Scorpio was never as easy to leave behind as they once believed. And that realization is creating emotions they may not be ready to face just yet. And that realization is creating emotions they may not be ready to face just yet. Because once someone stops running from the truth, they eventually reach a moment where they have to look directly at themselves, not at Scorpio, not at the connection, at themselves. And honestly, that's where this energy feels different. The Death card is here again, but this time, it doesn't feel connected to the ending of a chapter between two people. It feels connected to the ending of a version of themselves, a version built around pride, a version that always needed to be right, a version that listened more to fear than to their own heart. Wow, this feels incredibly personal, because I don't think this transformation happened overnight. I think life has been teaching this person lessons for a while now. Small lessons, difficult lessons, uncomfortable lessons. And eventually those lessons began pointing toward the same truth. Something needed to change. You know, there comes a point where blaming circumstances no longer works. Blaming timing no longer works. Blaming other people no longer works. Because the mirror is standing right in front of you. And that's exactly what I'm feeling. This person has been standing in front of their own reflection. Looking at choices they made. Looking at moments they avoided. Looking at things they wish they had handled differently. And instead of looking away, they're staying with it. The Strength card feels incredibly powerful here. Not loud, not dramatic, quiet strength. The kind that nobody applauds. The kind that happens behind closed doors. The kind that asks somebody to sit with their mistakes without turning away from them. Honestly, that may be one of the hardest things a person can do. Because growth sounds beautiful until it requires accountability. Growth sounds inspiring until it asks you to acknowledge where you were wrong. And this person is reaching that place. I keep hearing, I don't want to be that person anymore. Not because they're trying to impress Scorpio. Not because they're trying to win somebody back. Because they're tired. Tired of repeating the same patterns. Tired of allowing fear to make decisions. Tired of living in ways that no longer feel aligned with who they want to become. Okay, this energy is softening now. The Temperance card feels like somebody slowly learning balance, learning patience, learning how to respond rather than react, learning how to listen instead of assuming, learning how to trust their own inner voice instead of everybody else's opinions. And that's important, because some of the choices they made before came from noise, outside noise, expectations, influence, fear of judgment, fear of vulnerability, fear of being seen. But the more this person grows, the more those fears seem to lose their control. They're starting to understand that real connection requires honesty. Real connection requires courage. Real connection requires showing up as your authentic self, not as the version of yourself that feels safest. Wow, the star is shining so brightly here. And what I love about this energy is that it doesn't feel rushed. It feels hopeful. For the first time in a long time, I think this person is beginning to believe change is actually possible. Not perfect change, not instant change, real change, the kind that happens one choice at a time, one realization at a time, one difficult truth at a time. And as they continue moving through this process, something inside them is becoming clearer. They're beginning to understand that if they ever want a different outcome, they cannot return as the same person who created the old one. That version of themselves belongs to the past. The fears belong to the past. The excuses belong to the past. Because the person emerging from this transformation is looking at life differently now, looking at love differently, looking at Scorpio differently. And the closer they get to becoming the person they were always capable of being, the more one particular thought keeps returning to them. A thought they can no longer push aside. A thought that is becoming impossible to ignore no matter how hard they try. A thought that is becoming impossible to ignore no matter how hard they try. And the thought feels surprisingly simple, not complicated, not dramatic, just honest. I need to talk to Scorpio. Wow, that came through immediately because all of this growth, all of these realizations, all of this inner transformation has been leading somewhere. The judgment card is back on the table, and honestly, it feels like a moment of reckoning, not punishment, not pressure. A moment where somebody finally understands that avoiding a conversation doesn't erase its importance, it only delays it. I keep feeling this person rehearsing words in their head, thinking about what they would say, thinking about where they would start, thinking about whether Scorpio would even want to hear it. Because there are things they never explained, things they never admitted, things they never expressed honestly. And those unspoken words have become heavier over time. You know, sometimes silence feels easier in the beginning. But eventually silence develops a weight of its own, a weight that follows you, a weight that sits beside you, a weight that reminds you of everything left unsaid. That's what this feels like. This person is carrying words that have nowhere else to go. The Ace of Cups feels incredibly emotional, not in a reckless way, not in an impulsive way, in a sincere way. Because what I keep seeing is somebody lowering their defenses, somebody becoming willing to be vulnerable, somebody becoming willing to risk rejection if it means finally being truthful. Okay, that takes courage, especially for someone who once relied on avoidance, especially for someone who once allowed fear to make decisions, because vulnerability always involves uncertainty. There are no guarantees here, no promises, no certainty about how Scorpio will respond, and yet the desire to reach out continues growing stronger. The Two of Cups feels beautiful, not because it guarantees an outcome, but because it shows mutual recognition, recognition of what the connection meant, recognition of what was shared, recognition that some bonds leave a lasting imprint regardless of how much time passes. I keep feeling this person remembering moments that seemed ordinary at the time, moments they now understand differently, moments they wish they had appreciated more. And every memory keeps bringing them back to the same place, back to Scorpio, back to the connection, back to the feeling that something important was left unfinished. Honestly, I think they're becoming aware that this conversation isn't only about the past, it's also about who they have become. Because if they do reach out, they don't want to show up as the same person. They don't want to repeat old patterns. They don't want to recreate old wounds. They want Scorpio to see the changes, not through promises, not through speeches, through their energy, through their actions, through the way they carry themselves now. Wow. The World card feels incredibly significant here, because something is ending. A cycle of misunderstanding, a cycle of silence, a cycle of unfinished emotions that have been lingering between two people. And whenever a cycle closes, another possibility begins to appear. Not a guaranteed outcome, just a doorway, a choice, an opportunity. And that's where the energy becomes very interesting. Because this person's journey has brought them to the edge of that doorway. They can see it. They can feel it. They're standing close enough to know it's real. But they cannot decide what happens after they knock. That part belongs to Scorpio. That part belongs to free will. That part belongs to whatever Scorpio feels is right for their own heart. Because after everything that has happened, Scorpio deserves the right to choose. And I keep feeling this person understanding that, respecting that, maybe for the first time. The fear is still there. The uncertainty is still there. The possibility of rejection is still there. Yet none of those things seem strong enough to stop what is growing inside them anymore. Because the closer they move toward this moment, the more one feeling rises above everything else. A feeling that has survived distance, survived confusion, survived time. And it is becoming harder and harder for them to keep that feeling locked away inside. And whatever happens from here, Scorpio, I think the most important thing to remember is that truth has a finding its way to the surface. No matter how long it takes, no matter how many misunderstandings stand in the way, no matter how many people try to rewrite the story, what is real eventually reveals itself. And maybe that's exactly what this journey has been about. Not chasing validation, not forcing outcomes, not proving your worth. Simply becoming the version of yourself that no longer needs any of those things. Because the moment you stopped trying to convince the world who you are,
The world slowly began seeing it for itself.
so take what resonates, leave what doesn't, and trust yourself more than anyone else's opinion. Thank you for allowing me to spend this time with you. I truly appreciate your energy, your presence, and your trust. Take good care of yourself, Scorpio. And until our paths cross again, keep moving forward in your own quiet, powerful way. Bye.